Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we've got another big Monday college basketball DFS slate. And I say big Monday because that's what ESPN calls it, but it's actually a small slate. It is a 3-game college basketball DFS slate on DraftKings as well as FanDuel. We've got 2 games in the Big 12 and 1 in the ACC. And all 3 of these games are rematches of games that have already happened earlier this season. So we've got an abundance of information to go through, and we're going to dive deep into each of these 3 games and tell you what you can expect from each game, what you can kind of learn from the previous statistics from when these teams played, and then we're also going to break down if there's ever any injuries that you need to monitor, so that way you can know who you need to be getting into and out of your DFS lineups for this Monday night slate. So, if you have been a longtime viewer or listener, you probably know by now, but we're going to be doing a golf show tomorrow night and Monday night. So, there will not be a Tuesday preview for college basketball DFS. So, if you want my thoughts on the college basketball DFS slate, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed as well. Basically, Fantasy Corner Discord, we've got a lot of smart people in there who play DFS for a lot of different sports, and the college basketball chat in there has been jumping. And so, we've got a lot of smart people in there that pretty much every day we talk lineups, talk strategy, talk plays. And so Tuesday is going to be no different. So that's going to be the only place you can find me if you want information for Tuesday's slate. But I do hope to be back for later on in the week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. I will warn you though, I'm going out of town next weekend. So for the weekend slates, if you want to hear from me, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. That is where you can get that information. And I will still have the full articles on my Patreon as well. I do write an article for my Patreon for every college basketball DFS slate where I profile my core plays as well as kind of my general lineup strategy and attack strategy for each slate. So all of those, the discussion in the Discord and the articles on the Patreon will be business as usual this week, but the actual schedule will be a little bit different. So I wanted to let you guys know that. But if you go ahead and subscribe to the channel or subscribe to the audio feed, you will know when episodes drop. So that way you can be super aware of when or when not there is an episode. All right, so enough with the introduction. We've got 3 games to get to. So let's go ahead and dive into game number 1, West Virginia taking on Kansas State. So as promised, game number 1 is West Virginia heading to the Little Apple to take on Kansas State. This one is not the best game environment of the slate, if I'm being honest, but I still think there's plenty of guys you can go to on this slate that can give you plenty of value from a DFS perspective. So KenPom has this one projected to be 73 to 63 in favor of Kansas State. That is the lowest total on the slate, and it makes West Virginia by far the lowest team total on the slate. And this is a rematch of a previous meeting this season, and Kansas State won that one at West Virginia, 81 to 67. It is worth noting, though, that Jesse Edwards did not play in that game for West Virginia. That's a pretty big difference. Now, that West Virginia team right now, they're essentially going to play 7 guys unless someone gets in foul trouble. They're going to give big minutes to the starters of Krisa, Johnson, Battle, Slazinski, and Edwards. And then the 2 guys off the bench are going to be Farrakhan and Harris, and nobody else is really going to play a sizable role whatsoever. Now, we mentioned that Jesse Edwards did not play in that first meeting. I think that is an entire game changer for how both teams will attack this second meeting. He is one of the most consistent players on the slate. I think he is a bargain on FanDuel as well as DraftKings. And in the last 3 games, he's put up at least 34 fantasy points in each of those 3 games. And so Kansas State is not a great rebounding team. We saw Dylan DeSue have a good game against them last week. We saw the BYU bigs have a decent outcome against them as well. So this is a team that you can target the forward position against. And Jesse Edwards is a guy that doesn't need a whole lot of usage, doesn't need a whole lot of shots to reach value. He put up 36 fantasy points, only taking 8 shots, put up 34 fantasy points, only taking 5 shots. Like, if he gets you to 10 points and double-digit rebounds, a few assists, a few blocks, a few steals, like, that's an easy way to accumulate fantasy points. And he is such a good rebounder that he can easily do that. I think he is a really solid play, even though West Virginia as a whole is not exactly the team you want to be targeting. Speaking of that, we got Raekwon Battle, who, if Jesse Edwards is not shot dependent, Raekwon Battle is shot dependent. So at the start of the season, when he first got eligible, he was just absolutely chucking for this West Virginia team. And now he is kind of back to his old chucking ways. He has taken at least 11 shots in each of the last 6 games. 11 was the low mark against Iowa State. And so before that, it would have been, 5 straight games of 12 shots or more. In the previous game against Kansas State, he put up 28 fantasy points on 13 shots. So that is a total that he can absolutely get to in terms of shots. And this Kansas State defense hasn't exactly gotten any better. And so Raekwon Battle, a guy averaging 33, or a guy who has put up 33 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4, averaging 15 shots in those 4 games, he can absolutely get back to his previous total of 28 fantasy points in this matchup against Kansas State, in my opinion. He is seeing a regular amount of shot attempts that he needs to hit value, which he does need those shots to hit value. Kirk Kriisa is like the opposite of shot dependent as well. He is assist dependent. And so you look at his game log, he has his best games when West Virginia's offense has their best games. And unfortunately, they're only projected 63 points in this one. In the previous meeting against Kansas State, he played 31 minutes, 4 for 10 from the field. Not terrible. Put up 19.75 fantasy points. Not terrible, but not exactly what you want at a salary of 6,000. So on paper, a guy who is assist dependent, with a team total of 63 is not exactly what you want to target. However, let's mention this from the DFS angle, right? Like, this is a 3-game slate. You're going to have to get behind some plays that on paper aren't exactly the best plays. So could it be an angle to winning a contest to pick Kirk Kriisa and pick another West Virginia guy or two and just hope that West Virginia out of nowhere scores 75 to 80 points? I think it's a viable strategy in DFS. I don't think it's a likely outcome, but I think if you're going to be banking on this West Virginia team to score a lot of points, Kirk Kriisa needs to be in your lineup. After that, you've got Quinn Slazinski, who is a pass for me. Like, he plays a decent amount of minutes, but he just doesn't regularly see a lot of usage. At 5,800, we're going to really want him to get, at least 25 fantasy points, which he can get, but he doesn't get it with regularity. And so I just don't really know what to expect from him. In the previous game against Kansas State, he only had 15 fantasy points, 1 for 4 from the field. So he's a guy that might make a few of my lineups, but not many. I just don't really see a whole lot of upside in Quinn Slazinski. Kobe Johnson, though, is a guy that I do like as a value play on both DraftKings and FanDuel. So Kobe Johnson is like, he's out there on the floor. And so he's playing a ton of minutes, 28 minutes or more in each of his last 3 games, put up at least 16 fantasy points in each of his last 3 games, which, at a salary of $4,700, we can live with that, right? And, 21 in his last game against Iowa State, where he was 5 for 7 from the field. So definitely a guy that we can go to. And if you think that the game shoots out, kind of like the same concept with Kirk Kriisa, the more possessions you think are played in this game, the better it's going to be for Kobe Johnson, because he's going to be a guy who is out there and playing a ton of minutes as a supporting cast player. Not a high usage player, but he's going to be out there as a supporting player. I mentioned before, Farrakhan and Harris are the 2 bench guys. Not super interested in either of them. I just don't think that they play enough minutes at their usage rates to regularly hit 4x or 5x value. Harris did in his last game against Iowa State put up 16 fantasy points on 21 minutes, but it's just not something that occurs regularly. So they're not great plays. I think you can get your value elsewhere. I would way rather just pay a few hundred more and get Kobe Johnson. Now, on the Kansas State side, West Virginia gives up a ton of 3-pointers and a ton of assists, which leads to a lot of fantasy scoring in general. We've also talked about time and time again how they are one of the worst defensive backcourts in the nation. We have targeted guards against this West Virginia team numerous times, what's interesting is Arthur Kaluma is now the most expensive Kansas State Wildcat. He has had 2 really good games in the past week, put up 31 fantasy points against Texas and then 50 against BYU. So why is he all of a sudden seeing more and more fantasy scoring? Well, what's happening is he has been elite at playing the small forward spot and attacking teams who play 3 guards or play a small forward. It's what happened against Texas. It's what happened against BYU. And so West Virginia is a team that does that. Raekwon Battle plays the 3. And so in the previous game against West Virginia, Arthur Kaluma was 6 for 9 from the field, 25.75 fantasy points. That total might not sound that great, but he only took 9 shots to get there, and he was pretty efficient, 6 for 9 from the field. So if he continues to see more shots, which he has recently, he has led the team in shots in total in the last 2 games combined. So he absolutely is a guy who could get to value with this matchup, with this usage that he's been seeing. I really do like Arthur Kaluma on this side. Now, Tyler Perry is not been great, but he's not been awful recently either. 3 straight games, he's had over 27 fantasy points, but he's taking less shots as a result of Arthur Kaluma taking more. In the previous meeting against West Virginia, he had his floor game. He was 1 for 8 from the field on only only scoring 17 total fantasy points. I think that this is a situation to buy low on Tyler Perry. I think that a lot of people are going to look back at the game log and see that floor performance against West Virginia, when in reality, this is still a poor defensive backcourt. He's still taking a decent amount of shots. Like, we're seeing more go to Kaluma, but he's still taking 21 combined shots in his last 2 games. So I still think you can go to Tyler Perry here in this spot. Cam Carter has been the guy who has been most affected by the Arthur Kaluma breakout, though. He's only put up 22 and 13 fantasy points in the last 2 games, only taken 19 combined shots in those 2 games. But what he does have going for him is he was the guy who had the ceiling game against West Virginia the first time around, putting him 38 fantasy points on 6 for 14 from the field. So basically, the Kansas State side, when it comes to their big 3 guys, you're going to have to decide, are you going to prioritize recent form? Are you going to prioritize season-long usage? Or are you going to prioritize the previous meeting against West Virginia? Because your answer to that question would pretty much determine whether or not you want Kaluma, Perry, or Carter, or if you think that Kansas State's going to score north of 80 points in this one, which teams facing West Virginia have done quite regularly, you can play 2 of those 3 guys. Now, for the rest of the Kansas State supporting cast, David Ngason is my favorite. He has been pretty good for them lately, putting up in the last 4 games at least 20 fantasy points. Now, we would like more than that at a salary of 5,900, but the good news is previous time against West Virginia, he put up 33 fantasy points on only 27 minutes. Now, the thing to keep in mind there, though, is Kansas State dominated the glass in that game because West Virginia did not have Jesse Edwards. So you go back and look at Will McNair Jr.'s game log. He had 25 fantasy points on 28 minutes against West Virginia in that game. So those 2 guys definitely got a benefit from not seeing Jesse Edwards and being able to stay out of foul trouble and then not having to see Jesse Edwards. So definitely that is a little bit of an asterisk on those 2 guys' performances, but I do like David Ngason because he is playing a lot more minutes than he normally has recently, and more minutes tend to lead to more fantasy points, especially against a poor defensive team like West Virginia. Day-Day Ames is the technical starting point guard for Kansas State. He's a true freshman. He plays a decent amount of minutes, but he doesn't really do a whole lot while he's out there. To me, he's one of the best punt plays on the slate, but he's nothing more than that. There's been nothing recently to bank on that you can really factor in any kind of fantasy scoring whatsoever. In fact, he has not had a 4x value game in conference play, but he is still playing the minutes. He is still out there. And again, if you're playing enough minutes against a poor defensive team like West Virginia, then there's an opportunity for fantasy points. Also, if this game were to happen to turn into a blowout, they'll probably try to get a lot of minutes and a lot of shots for their true freshman guard that they're hyped about his future. So Day-Day Ames would be a benefit, or if a beneficiary, if this game turns into a blowout. Jarrell Colbert has been playing minutes as a big for them, but he has a really high foul rate. Like, he just can't stay on the floor for a long period of time, which really limits his upside. Again, I see him as a punt play here on this slate. Next up, we have got Miami taking on North Carolina, which is a considerably better game environment than West Virginia, Kansas State. KenPom has this one projected to be 84-70 in favor of North Carolina, which makes this the widest spread on the slate, and it makes North Carolina the highest team total on the slate. In the previous meeting between these 2 teams, North Carolina won 75-72, so 147 points scored in that one. That's a pretty solid game environment in my book. Now, on the Miami side, what's worth noting is Nigel Pack is the primary injury concern for this Monday night slate. He has not appeared in the last 3 games. He played against Clemson, but didn't really do a whole lot. And he's very worth noting if he plays, because against Carolina the previous time, he put up 17 shots, put up 30 fantasy points. So definitely a guy that if he is active, you got to feel like he has a legitimately high ceiling based off of what he did against the Tar Heels in the first matchup. Now, what it has also happened since Pack has been out, Bensley Joseph has been an elite fantasy option at running the point guard. In the 3 games that Nigel Pack has missed, Bensley Joseph has put up 34, 18, and 31 fantasy points. But get this, he also has put up 29 total shots in each of the last 2 games. So that's an average of 28 fantasy points per game on a guy who's now taking double-digit shots when he is at the point guard position, when Nigel Pack lit North Carolina up from the point guard position the last time these 2 teams played. Bensley Joseph operated as an off-ball guard in that game and still put up 28 fantasy points in 36 minutes. So Bensley Joseph, he checks a lot of boxes for him to beat because he excelled against Carolina in the first meeting, is in an expanded role now, in a role that also worked well against Carolina in the first meeting. So Bensley Joseph checking off a lot of boxes, one of my favorite plays plays here on this Monday night slate if Nigel Pack is in fact out. Now, it's also worth noting that Miami had their whole preseason starting five for that first meeting. And I mean by that, Nigel Pack, Bensley Joseph, Wooga Poplar, Matthew Cleveland, and Norchad Omier. We've talked about how all season long this Miami team never plays anybody off the bench. And so basically what you would have if Nigel Pack missed this game is Keyshawn George would slide into the lineup in Pack's position. And he has been hit or miss lately. And I mean that in the most accurate way, because he only had one fantasy point against Boston College. And then last Saturday, he had 42 fantasy points against Georgia Tech. So he is going to be playing big time minutes because this team rarely plays a bench if Nigel Pack misses again, but he's definitely a boom or bust option. He did not play in the first meeting against North Carolina. Now, in the first meeting against North Carolina, Norchad Omier was great. In that game, Omier and Pack were the only two that were above 21% usage for Miami, and all five starters played 29 minutes or more in that game. So basically, Pack and Omier were the guys that were getting all the shots, and everybody was out there on the floor. So Omier in that game was 7 for 17 from the floor, put up 20 and 11, put up 46 fantasy points. That is just elite. However, the 17 shots was his high in ACC play. So it almost seems like they really wanted to attack their offense through Norchad Omier in that game. And so I would expect to continue considering that they were not a bad offense in that game. And their other high usage guy from that game, Nigel Pack, might in fact miss this game. So definitely like Norchad Omier here in this game. The only concern is going up against that Carolina front court. He's going to have to stay out of foul trouble, which he was able to do last time. He played 37 minutes and only fouled 3 times. So I really do like Norchad Omier as a pay-up option. I like him a lot better than Wooga Poplar. I have not played a lot of Wooga Poplar this season because generally I find him to be pretty shot dependent. In that North Carolina game, he put up 31 fantasy points, had a double-double, which he does not do very often, on 5 for 13 shooting. So could he be getting more shot attempts now that Nigel Pack is likely to not play this game? Possibly, but I just would rather play a guy who can give me more peripheral stats than Poplar, a guy like Matthew Cleveland. Now, what's interesting with Cleveland is he only put up 15 fantasy points in that game against North Carolina, but he's put up 31 and 23 in his last 2 games. When Keyshawn George is playing and in the starting lineup, Matthew Cleveland plays more of the 3 as opposed to the 4. So that kind of gives him a little bit of a different look offensively. And against North Carolina, it means he will be going up against Cormac Ryan as opposed to Harrison Ingram. So it definitely does change up the matchup, definitely does give him a little bit of upside. And I don't think a lot of people are going to click Matthew Cleveland because he only had 15 fantasy points against them the first time. Now, after that, like I said, they pretty much are just going to play 5 guys, and we kind of went over all 5 of them that I expect to play. Paul Jobay has really been the main bench player since Nigel Pack has been out. He's played at least 18 minutes in each of the last 3 games, put up 11, 0.75, and then 12 fantasy points in those 3 games. So there's not a whole lot of upside, but in terms of punt plays, that's not a bad one. Michael Nwoko would be a guy who would play minutes if Norchad Omier were to get in foul trouble. And then Ja'Kai Robinson has also played a little bit of minutes recently since the Nigel Pack injury, but it has not turned into a whole lot of fantasy scoring. So really that Miami side, whether Pack is in or out, I'm really just focusing my efforts on their first 5 players, which would be the top 5 on the board if Pack is out. And it would be Pack in place of Keyshawn George if he is in. Now, on the North Carolina side, 4 starters played 34 minutes or more in that first meeting, and that was R.J. Davis, Elliot Cadeau, Harrison Ingram, and Armando Bacot. Cormac Ryan and Paxton Wojcik pretty much split the minutes of the last guy on the floor. Cormac Ryan got in foul trouble in that game. However, Cormac Ryan has been great recently. The last 3 games, he's put up 23 fantasy points or more in all 3. He has been lights out shooting the 3-point shot. He has been 44% or better from 3 in each of the last 3 games, and he is a combined 14 for 27, which is slightly north of 50% in those 3 games. So if he's going to be able to keep this hot shooting streak up, he's a guy that you have to consider as a part of your lineups, especially in terms of a game stacking option, because a lot of his 3s are catch and shoot, meaning somebody is getting an assist off of them, which just leads to more fantasy points. Now, back to guys that did or did not play a whole lot in the first meeting. So in the first meeting against Miami, Seth Trimble did not play, which led to the Elliot Cadeau ceiling game. Against Miami, Elliot Cadeau played 35 minutes, which was a season high, put up 14 shots, which was a season high, and put up 41 fantasy points, which was a season high, on a season high usage rate. So Elliot Cadeau had his breakout game against Miami, and he has not put up more than 18 fantasy points in a game since. So can you go back to him? Yes. But is it likely that that game was the outlier as opposed to the norm? Also, yes, because Seth Trimble was not there to eat into some of his minutes, which we have seen in the last two games. And he also had a season high in shot attempts and fantasy points. So just probably not a guy I'm going to be playing a whole lot of. But in terms of a game stacking option, he's got a very high assist rate and he's probably going to play north of 25 minutes. So definitely a guy that you can consider as a game stacking piece, but don't expect 41 fantasy points again from Elliot Cadeau. Now, on to Carolina's big three. So Armando Bacot in that first meeting against Miami put up 35 fantasy points. We are now seeing Armando Bacot get back to being the old Armando Bacot where he has had double doubles in 5 straight games. That is what he does. And so I think you can absolutely play him. I think the matchup against Omier is a little risky. He did foul out in that first meeting against Miami, but he still played 37 minutes. So I think with both of the bigs in this game, Bacot and Omier, I probably only want to pick between one of them because if one of them is going off, it likely means the other is in foul trouble. That's definitely something to keep in mind as you're building your lineups. RJ Davis is coming off of an absolute floor game against Virginia where he was 1 for 14 from the field and he still put up 23 fantasy points. So basically, his floor is 3x value. Good to know. Against Miami, he was 6 for 19 from the field and put up 48 fantasy points. So definitely like RJ Davis in this spot. And again, if you're looking to stack this game up, he did have 5 assists in that game. So you can definitely pair him with some other Carolina guys and hope that Davis has another big assisting game. To me, Harrison Ingram exists as the pivot off of Bacot and Davis because against Miami, he did not have as much success. He only took 7 shots, only put up 23 fantasy points. He had a big run at like the end of January where he was just like killing it for Carolina and it coincided with Armando Bacot slumping. But now that Bacot is back, Harrison Ingram has been just okay. In the last 5 games, he's been held to less than 24 fantasy points 3 times, but he's also scored 37 fantasy points or more 2 times. So there is some upside there. I probably would not pair him with Armando Bacot, but there is a little bit of upside to play Harrison Ingram here in this spot. All right, so that does it for the first 2 games. Let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then let's talk about the last one. Now, before we dive into this last game, I do want to remind you guys, if you like what you're seeing here on YouTube, please hit the like button and please subscribe to the channel. It really does help me out a ton when you guys do that. The YouTube algorithm makes videos more findable the more likes it has. So when you guys do that, it helps the videos, find more people, get more viewers, get more subscribers, and grow the community, which is what we're all about here. So please help me out and do that if you like what you're seeing here on YouTube. And if you're listening on audio, please rate and review. Those help the podcast show up in searches. And right now, if you search College Basketball DFS on Spotify or Apple, we are the first podcast that shows up. And that's thanks to you guys for doing that for me. So if you have enjoyed these videos this season, or if you have been helped by these videos this season, all I'm asking for in return is a like and a subscribe and a rate and review. That's all I need, and I really do appreciate that. You guys are the absolute best. That'll help keep growing this community that we have kind of slowly built brick by brick here as we close in on 500 subscribers. So let's go ahead and talk about this last game. So we've got Baylor heading to Fort Worth to take on TCU, and can I be honest? I'm not really a believer in either of these teams when March comes around. I have watched Texas play both these teams, and I have not been impressed by either of these two teams. So, I guess since they're playing each other, one of them's got to win. But just kind of keep that in the back of your brain is that when March comes around, I'm not going to be picking these two teams anyway. KenPom has this game projected to be 78-77 in favor of TCU. The original meeting this season was a 105-102 TCU victory in triple overtime. That game was 76-76 at the end of regulation. So 152 points scored in that one definitely is going to make it a good game environment. And the KenPom total 155 is the highest of the night. So definitely a game that you want to be getting some pieces from. Ray J. Dennis was the team leader in usage rate and in shots in the first meeting against TCU. He ended with 45 fantasy points on 24, 4, and 10 on 9 for 17 shooting. That's pretty solid. We've talked about all season long how TCU gives up a really high assist rate. Their guards are just not great defensive players. And so guys like Ray J. Dennis who can score it and assist it are going to get a ton of fantasy points against this team. I think he's a really solid play at 7,600. In the last 4 games he has played, he's been over 29 points 3 out of 4 times, over 33 points twice. So, he's been good enough recently, and the track record against TCU really makes me a fan of Ray J. Dennis here in this spot. And he has such a high assist rate, averaging over 6 per game, that if you play him, I would highly recommend stacking him with somebody else as well, because that way you can double dip. When he's getting assists, somebody else is getting points. Now, Ives Misi was the other hero in that first game. So he ended that game against TCU with 39 fantasy points on 10 for 14 shooting, which is by far the most shots he has taken in a game this season. But we have also seen TCU, not only they struggle to defend guards, they've struggled to defend the center position at times as well. And so it's not shocking that Misi had a big game in that one. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, dang, Mike, he was 10 for 14 shooting. He's never going to do that again. Well, here's the thing. He's a pretty efficient player for the most part. The Houston game notwithstanding, because everybody looks bad against Houston, he has been 5 for 6, 5 for 5, 5 for 9, and 6 for 9 in the 4 games before that Houston game. So he's a very efficient player from the field. And when he plays a ton of minutes, he tends to put up a ton of fantasy points. And I really like the chances of him doing that again against the TCU that he was really successful against the first time. Pretty big fan of Ives Misi here on this slate. Now, also, what's interesting enough is that Jacoby Walter put up 33 fantasy points in that original meeting on 2 for 12 shooting, which is not great, but to me that represents like a floor shooting game for him. And he still put up 33 fantasy points because this TCU team gives up a lot of fantasy points in a lot of different ways. And oh, by the way, the game did go to triple overtime. So Walter, if he is able to shoot the ball better, definitely has a lot of upside in my opinion. And ever since Langston Love has gotten injured, Walter has seen very consistent shots, very consistent usage. And so I definitely think he's a guy that you can go back to here on this slate as well as Jaden Nunn, who has also seen increased shots and increased usage since the injury to Langston Love. However, my one piece of advice is I would probably not play Nunn and Walter together. They tend to cancel each other out. One of them tends to get hot from behind the arc at a time. Recently, it has been slightly in advantage of Jaden Nunn, but I definitely think you can play both these guys. Both of them do have a lot of upside here on this slate. And then Jalen Bridges playing the 4 spot for Baylor has also been increased usage with Langston Love being injured. He's been over 26 fantasy points in 4 straight, which is 4x value for his current salary. So definitely a big fan of all the mid-tier Baylor guys here in this game. And if they end up being one of the higher scoring teams on the slate, you're going to have a lot of Baylor guys who end up hitting 4 and 5x value. In the first game against TCU, Bridges was not great, only 21 fantasy points, but his role has been expanded with the injury to Langston Love. Now, Langston Love still has a Q tag here in this game. I don't expect him to play. I just don't. But if he does, that would obviously kind of throw a wrench in things. It would spread the usage out a little bit, and it would really make Dennis and Misi the only 2 guys who are unaffected by that. And Baylor, like a lot of other teams here on this slate, doesn't play a lot of a bench. Miro Little is kind of the guy that spells the guards, and Ojan Wuna is the guy that spells Misi. But you'd have to have some serious foul trouble for those guys to see a ton of minutes, and they're nothing more than punt plays, in my opinion. Now, on the TCU side, Jameer Nelson Jr. was their best player by far in that original meeting. Look, he's their usage leader on the season, and he just kind of started being a starter. In that game against Baylor, he was 11 for 18 from the field and put up 41 fantasy points. That's really good. Obviously, triple overtime helped a little bit on that, right? But since he's been in the start lineup, he's been playing more minutes, and he's been a very consistent fantasy producer, over 24 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. So definitely a guy that I think you can go to, and he can accumulate fantasy points in a variety of ways. If this game environment ends up being really good, Jameer Nelson is going to be a guy who's a beneficiary of it. Now, also what's interesting is Travion Tennyson is not taken well from a fantasy perspective to Jameer Nelson Jr. being in the starting lineup. Against Baylor, he did put up 31 fantasy points, though. But the problem is that he's just taking less shots, getting less peripheral stats now that Jameer Nelson is in the lineups. And so he's probably a pass for me, even though he did have a lot of success against Baylor in the first meeting. Avery Anderson, also another guy that moved to the bench with Jameer Nelson Jr. coming to the starting lineup, and another guy whose production has gone down since that move, so he is probably also mostly a pass for me. However, I will give this advice that I've given a ton of times on my shows before. In DFS, sometimes a bad play becomes a good play when nobody makes it. And so maybe could you catch a low-owned Tennyson or Avery Anderson going off? Absolutely, but I just don't think it's a very likely outcome. Now, also in that first Baylor game, Emmanuel Miller was just okay. He took 16 shots, which is quite a lot for him. He doesn't always do that, and he only put up 29 fantasy points. But he is a guy who does have a very legitimate ceiling. Against Cincinnati, he put up 41 fantasy points over the weekend. Against Texas Tech, he had 34. This is a guy who can put up double doubles, which gets you those 3-point bonus on DraftKings. So he's a guy that I definitely think you can target, but I'm not super duper interested in it because I would have liked to see more success out of a guy who played that many minutes in the first meeting against Baylor. Now, what's also interesting, you do have some slight injury news to monitor here for TCU. Ernest Uday is questionable. He has sat the last 2 games, I believe it is. Maybe 3. It's either 2 or 3 games for TCU. Let's see. He last played against Kansas State, and yes, he has sat the last 2 games. Now, in those 2 games, what you have seen is the center position has been split between Jacoby Coles and Essa Mustafa, both of which have been good. Jacoby Coles scored 25 or 24.5 in both those games without playing more than 22 minutes in a game. Essa Mustafa put up 23 and 22 fantasy points playing 19 and 18 minutes in both those games. So if Ernest Uday is going to be out again, Coles as well as Mustafa make for great plays. On a points per dollar basis, I would prefer Mustafa. However, Coles does tend to play at a higher usage rate, and I think a lot of people are going to, click down to Mustafa, which is going to make Coles a little bit squeezed out in terms of ownership. My one caution is this, though. If you plan on playing Coles or Mustafa, you better have a late swap plan in place if Uday is active. Coles might be pretty unaffected, if I'm being honest. He tended to play the same amount of minutes if Uday was in as if Uday was out. But Mustafa would have next to no role if Uday is active. So if you're playing Mustafa, what I would recommend doing is figuring out combinations of 2 and 3 guys that if Uday is back in the lineup, that you can get off of Mustafa by, spending up or spending down elsewhere. That's just my opinion. This is a game that you're going to want to get multiple pieces from regardless, with it being a 3-game slate. So you can give yourself plenty of late swap options if, in fact, Uday is active. If I'm being honest, I don't expect him to be active in this game, but if you intend on playing Essa Mustafa, you have got to know the injury status of Ernest Uday because Mustafa's role would be pretty much nothing if Uday is active. All right, so that does it for the Big Monday slate, the 3-game Monday, February 26th slate of college basketball DFS. As I said earlier, if you like what you see here on the channel, y'all, please hit the like button for the video and please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on audio, you can rate and review. I appreciate it so much when you guys do that, and I'm hoping that I was able to give you guys a good episode that will allow you guys to win some money here and keep you guys coming back and keep you guys hitting that like and subscribe button more and more. Now, if you do want more from me, there are a few places you can get that. I kind of mentioned a little bit about this at the top of the show, but you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I'm more than happy to answer any questions on Twitter, as well as I tweet out pretty much every update for the show that you would need. And then also join the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description. I mentioned it from the jump, but basically it's a lot of people that bounce a lot of ideas off each other. We've had a lot of winners in college basketball DFS recently, but we also have other sports like baseball is coming up, golf and NBA. There's just a lot going on in there, and you'll only know about it if you join it. And then also I will have the full articles for my Patreon every single day this week. So head on over to the Patreon. You can get those core plays as well as that lineup strategy and attack strategy for a little bit of a charge. All right, so that does it for this video, y'all. So, pretty much thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. Hopefully I was able to give you guys plenty of information to build your lineups here for this big Monday slate. And I look to be back for the Wednesday night slate for college basketball. In between, there will be a golf episode. So, if you like what we do here for college basketball, check out a golf episode. Get into golf DFS. It's an absolute blast. It's one of my favorite DFS sports. So, thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. Best of luck to you on the Monday slate, and I will see you guys next time.